don't know sex when it comes to the birds and the bees.
As a matter of fact, I do know about the birds and the bees, Miss Voiceover. The birds and the bees is a metaphor used with children to talk about sex. Although its origins are unclear, some experts give credit to Samuel Taylor Coleridge when he referred to the two species in the context of love in his 1825 collection, Work Without Hope. All nature seems at work. The bees are stirring, birds are on the wing, and I the while, the sole unbusy thing, not honey make, nor pair, nor build, nor sing. Other experts have given credit to John Evelyn for the origin of the birds and the bees, when he wrote in his 16th century diary, that stupendous canopy of Corinthian brass. It consists of 4 wreathed columns, encircled with vines, on which hang little cherubs, birds, and bees.
All right, you have successfully demonstrated that you know how to do a Google search on the birds and the bees. But tell me, what do the birds actually represent in this metaphor?
Well...
Tell me, what do the bees represent in this metaphor? Tell me what the relationship between the birds and the bees represent in this metaphor.
Okay, you got me. I don't know. I admit it. Even with my pompous-ass attitude and my fake English accent, I'm like most people, thinking they know a lot more about sex than they actually do, even when it comes to the simplest of things, like the birds and the bees.
Don't fret too much about it. You are correct about one thing. The birds and the bees are a metaphor used to explain sex to children. But what exactly this metaphor represents, few people know. What do the birds represent in the birds and the bees? Birds lay eggs, and eggs are synonymous with ova. Women have ova. Thus, birds represent women. What do the bees represent in the birds and the bees? Bees pollinate flowers, and pollen is analogous to sperm. Men have sperm. Thus, bees represent men. What does the relationship between the birds and the bees represent? Birds and their eggs having a relationship with bees, and their pollen represents women and their ova having coital sex with men and their sperm for reproduction. Now you know exactly what the birds and the bees represent. Philosophers call metaphors like the birds and the bees complex arguments because their meanings are based on overlapping premises, and these premises have assumptions. Here's where it gets weird. Children's brains are incapable of understanding complex arguments. You heard me right. Children's brains cannot understand complex arguments. So when we use the birds and the bees metaphor with children, it confuses them about sex, reproduction, and women's and men's roles in sexual relationships. And without accurate sources of information, this confusion will serve as a foundation for children's understanding about their own and other sexuality. To see exactly how this confusion develops, let's go within little Johnny's mind when he asked his father about sex.
Daddy, where do babies come from?
Well, little Johnny, let me tell you about the birds and the bees.
As father is talking, let's take a look at what little Johnny would already have to know in order to understand what his father is talking about. Johnny would have to know birds have the capacity to lay eggs. Johnny would have to know only female birds have the capacity to lay eggs. Johnny would have to know female birds laying eggs is kind of like women, but women's eggs are called ova, and women have about 1 million ova, which are not laid, but instead within the woman's ovaries. Johnny would have to know bees have the capacity to pollinate plants. Johnny would have to know when bees collect pollen from the flower of a plant, some pollen from the male reproductive organ of the flower sticks to the hairs of the bee's body. When the bee visits another flower, some of the pollen is rubbed off onto the female reproductive organ of the flower. When this happens, fertilization is possible. And Johnny would have to know the pollen stuck to the bee's body is kind of like men, but men's pollen is called sperm and isn't stuck to their bodies, but instead within the epididymis, of men's testicles and is transferred within an ejaculate containing about 100 million other sperm cells when the men become excited.
And that's where babies come from.
So, let me get this straight, Daddy. Human babies come from birds, bees, and flowers pollinating one another? Is this some eccentric form of bestiality?
Moral of the story: if you want to screw children up for the rest of their lives when it comes to relationships, sex, and sexuality, use metaphors to teach them about sex. How about little Johnny's father answered little Johnny's question in a different way?
Daddy, where do babies come from?
Well, little Johnny, babies come from coital sex. Coital sex is when a man and a woman consensually decide to have the man's penis inside the woman's vagina.
So, let me get this straight, Daddy. Babies come from women and men mutually wanting to have sex with one another?
Moral of the story: if you want to allow children to understand themselves and others and be empowered by relationships, sex, and sexuality, teach them about sex without using metaphors, mysteries, or myths. It's official. You do know sex. At least when it comes to the birds and the bees.